Well, come on, all of you big, strong men. Uncle Sam needs your help again. Got himself in a terrible jam way down yonder in Vietnam. Put down your books and pick up a gun. We're gonna have a whole lot of fun. And it's 1, 2, 3.
We have become strangely comfortable with the idea of war being all fun and games. Because you know what we usually use as the subject matter for fun and games? War.
Face-to-face tabletop strategic battles. It's social, it's creative, and it's fun.
The National Historical Society of Gettysburg now dedicates the Civil War chess set.
Oh, you sound like battleships.
Not every game is about war, violence, or physical conflict, but an awful lot of them are. Maybe even a majority of them are. Recreational competition may well be based on the idea of conflict. War games, much like most other games, have winners and losers who make moves against one another, and systemic consequences for those moves incentivize the players' actions. But in real life, the consequences of conflict are not always systemic. They are unpredictable. More often than not, they end in tragedy and disaster. So, to put our minds at ease about the constant mental uneasiness of living in a highly competitive, militarily advantaged, war-loving nuclear superpower, we have recreational gaming. It's like games are there to say, hey, you know, if we take war and just strip away the civilian casualties, the collateral damage, the diseases and the famines, the post-war political power struggles, and the stifling, horrifying desperation and inhumanity that prevents both sides from playing fair and following rules, it's not so bad. So it's with that ethos that the Wargame series charges into battle. Is there any better example of a game having a more blunt and honest title? It's a game about war. That's honest advertising. There's no way anyone's gonna look at this product and think, gee, I sure do wonder what I'm getting myself into here. Which is funny, because you actually should be worrying about what you're getting yourself into here. Though this is my first time playing the series, it's evident that these games are not for everyone. You really have to commit to it. There's a steep learning curve that threw a lot of my trained video game logic expectations out the window, largely thanks to a totally ineffective tutorial that's nothing more than a few HTML files on how to play the game. The learning curve is made worse by the 1,400 different units this game has. I'm serious, they even put in a search bar to help you find what you're looking for. 1,400 lovingly crafted war machines are at your disposal, and each one has a huge stat sheet of unconventional variables that are carefully designed to balance them against some other units somewhere out there in the pile. But getting used to that really isn't so bad. Eventually you get to a point where you can reliably make some judgments just by glancing through these stat sheets, and you're often limited to the selection available to one of 17 factions, and oh god, 17 factions is a lot, but okay, like, they're not that different, because Wargame skews a bit towards realism, which takes a while to get used to, and it also means that the factions have superficially the same lineup of units. They're all vehicle-mounted guns that kill whatever they're shooting at in usually one hit. But the vast differences between all those units lie in the subtleties, and being able to exploit the subtleties between similar units is what sets the skill ceiling for high-level play, and the process of getting there is a rich and rewarding journey. It's not quite the same learning cliff of a Paradox game, but it's a significantly steeper curve than most other RTSs out there. But not because it's built to be difficult, it's just different in unexpected ways. It reminds me a lot of the games that had the Tom Clancy branding on it back before they went all sci-fi fantasy with the brand. Wargame's lustful fetish for military hardware contributes to gameplay that looks familiar but plays drastically differently, because its own interpretation of realism requires you to unlearn genre conventions that you're used to. I am used to the Total War games. I'm a big fan of that series. So when someone pitched Wargame to me as a modern-day themed Total War game, I was pretty interested. After all, they do share similar features. There's a turn-based strategy game on a top-down campaign map that leads to real-time battles on 3D maps that represent small chunks of that campaign map. There's an auto-resolve option for those battles that you can scum around using quick saves, and the battles begin with unlimited time for a deployment phase before the fighting. Battles have no resource management or base building, just a finite amount of units that you have to make do with, and much like Total War, the enemy AI is more than happy to blindly march into your most well-fortified defenses. But this isn't a historical setting. This isn't Total War, this is modern war. well, 1985 war, and so the acceptable method of killing hundreds of human beings as efficiently as possible is not done by stabbing them with some variation of pointed sticks, but rather by some variation of blowing them up, preferably from half a mile away. You don't march lines of troops in formation because then they'd be close enough to get blown up together. You don't want to move your units out of trees or urban cover because then they'll get spotted from half a mile away and get blown up. You don't want to do tank rushes or form defensive perimeters or play too slowly because once you get spotted, the other player will get right to work blowing you up from the longest distance possible, and the game will depict it with all the bombastic explosions and kinetic chaos of a battlefield game, just zoomed out from a spy plane's perspective. Figuring out how, where, when, and why to blow up enemy units is all about managing a careful mix of tanks, planes, recon, and artillery. It's less about playing these units off against each other in direct combat like the rock-paper-scissors balance of most RTSs, and more about careful positioning and spotting, or ambushing the enemy in locations that they think are safe. Or, if all else fails, then it's about shelling the ever-loving freedom out of the general direction that the enemy might be in. It hardly resembles the most basic archetypes of RTS combat. If a match ever does get to a point where foot soldiers actually are shooting at each other with rifles, then both sides are probably doing things very, very wrong. Most combat will be vehicle to vehicle, but infantry are still really useful for hiding in forests and buildings, which makes them invisible to enemies and thus unable to be blown up. But you can use napalm or flamethrowers to blow them up, or artillery if you manage to spot them first. But firing your own artillery invites the enemy to counterfire, so you have to shoot and scoot, or use cluster bombs as counter-artillery. Or aircraft can safely attack artillery, which can be countered with fighter planes, or with anti-aircraft guns, which can be countered with heavy armor, which can be countered with more airplanes, or hidden armor, or infantry ambushes, or more artillery, which can be countered by just playing stealthily and quietly to keep from getting spotted, which is probably the most important thing to learn how to do. It's also the hardest thing to do on desert maps that have no cover, which makes matches on them all about really tricky offensive tank battles. Denser maps favor infantry tactics instead, that let you ambush oncoming forces defensively. Sticking with the totally not Tom Clancy branding, the game depicts a 1980s Cold War gone hot, and I kinda like how each nation's most cost-effective units pay homage to their historical strengths. Never fight a land war in Asia because China's got super cheap and effective infantry who you can cheaply spread between all the roadside towns on the map. The UK has more expensive special ops infantry, and the US is all about overpowered naval and air units, and the USSR is all about pumping out fast, versatile helicopters. But you can't specialize. You have to keep your units mixed. Combined arms is a really important concept in this game. Managing an efficient balance of a complicated group of units is what allows for incredibly deep strategic possibilities here, and it's also what wins matches. But what that complexity sacrifices is elegance. They tried really hard to give you an iconic representation of what all these units are going to do at a glance, but in the heat of battle and from a distance, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between a M113A1 loaded with an anti-air Red-Eye squad to a M113A1 carrying an M72 law crew. You know, I'm not a military buff. I just play a lot of video games. I know some of these things, but at some point all of these numbers and abbreviations are gonna fly over my head. Maybe they could have fixed this problem by giving you the ability to manually rename units, so that way I could call the only recon helicopter in the starting US deck to Recon Chopper, instead of OH-58C Kiowa. But all of that complexity just adds to the strategy. You can manually fire at an enemy's general direction from outside their range to suppress them while waiting on bombers to fly over and flush them out. You can sneak infantry from one block of houses to another, totally invisibly to sneak them close to enemy armor. You can pop smoke with your artillery to cover your advances or to dupe the enemy into thinking you're advancing from someplace you're not. Those are just a few of the tricks that I learned after my first few online matches. I was getting absolutely stomped, but I was having a lot of fun figuring this stuff out, and if a game is making losing fun, then it's probably doing something right. It feels so good to discover a new multiplayer game that just might have years of playability left, and this feels like it could be one of those. There are so many options here. There are 34 maps with 17 factions that have 1,400 different units with enough subtle differences between them to manifest into limitless amounts of strategy. And with 4v4 and even 10 versus 10 matches, you end up playing games where team play matters, where you can mark artillery targets for other players, or flank the sides of front lines they're maintaining, or work out specializations for your units to maximize your team's adaptability. Matches can go on for 45 minutes and you can be at the edge of your seat that whole time. No two matches will ever play the same. It's a multiplayer game that is as varied, unpredictable, limitless, and addictive as the community is going to make it. What's less promising are the offerings on the single-player side. Red Dragon has 4 different campaigns, but they might not be what you expect from a game like this. They didn't go the Total War route with these things. They're not long-lasting 40-hour epic campaigns that span the breadth of planet Earth itself. They take place on rather small maps with blunt, immediate objectives that have to be rushed because you have a tight turn limit to capture them within. And since the computer AI is nothing to write home about, those turn limits are actually going to be your real enemy. But there's a framework in those campaigns for a gloriously epic, globe-trotting video game version of Red Storm Rising. But they didn't really opt for grand strategy here, which is sad because they might have been able to pull it off by just expanding the map and changing the rules a bit. As it stands, these campaigns feel limiting and claustrophobic, but they had the potential to be grand. Besides the campaigns, there's also a generous skirmish mode, but it's better suited for practicing for multiplayer rather than actually serving as an alternative to it. Wargame Red Dragon feels like one of the deepest and most satisfying strategy games I've played in years. It manages to make the tired modern warfare setting feel interesting again, and the process of learning your way through its complicated game of checks and balances is very rewarding. It is yet another weird reminder that the horrors of war have provided us with ample material to make great games from.